Hi, welcome to another English Language A-Level video with me, Paul from QE Darlington. And this one, as you can see, is about the NEA, the Non-Exam Assessment, Original Writing Short Story. First of all, let's just put this into context. What are the different assessments you're doing on this course? Remember, it's an 80-20 split on your English Language A-Level. 80% of it is exam, 20% is the coursework, or the NEAs as they're called now. Your paper one is the language, the individual and society, and that's split into two sections. So everything that we've done so far on the course in term one has really been getting you ready for that. Section A, meanings and representations. The section B you do next year, that's CLUD, that's the children's language development. Your paper two is called language diversity and change. The diversity material you do next term. It's fascinating stuff. In the exam, you get to write an essay either about language change or about language diversity. And in section B, there is this thing called language discourses, where you analyse and compare two lengthy pieces of journalism in the exam, and then you write your own opinion article. So between the two of those, that's 80% of your total assessment. There are two pieces of NEA. The second piece that you do in the second year is called language investigation. So this is 10% of the course, and it's an extended analysis of student-chosen linguistic data. You're going to love that. And then something else that you're going to love is this one here. So this is your original writing that we're about to do now. This is where you submit to the board either a piece of narrative fiction with a commentary or a persuasive text and the commentary. And so the way that we do it here at the QE is that in term one, you do a short story plus a commentary. And then in term three, you do a persuasive text plus a commentary. And at the end of the year, put the two together. We decide which of the two is going to be better. And then ultimately, we send them off to the board to be moderated. Okay, so that's where your original writing fits in. What do you actually submit on this original writing? Well, there are four elements. So element one is an annotated style model. So on the short story, we don't just say to you, go off and write a short story. Prior to that, you need to be reading lots of short stories so that you understand about the genre. And then you find one that particularly floats your boat and you annotate it. And that's going to be submitted to the board. Along with, of course, your short story itself, which is a mere 750 words. So you have to use words in a very concise, mean way. You cannot be submitting something that's 1,000 words. You can't be submitting something that's waffly. It's got to be very, very trimmed down and concise. You also submit a commentary, which is the same word length and is worth the same number of marks. And in your commentary, what you're going to be doing is comparing the language choices from the style model with the language choices in your short story itself. And then finally, the last thing that you submit is a bibliography. So it's a list of references. So it's just a list of the different texts that you've accessed during the process of researching and then doing your short story. Okay, so things you must not do on your coursework. So the following things are completely forbidden. One, obviously you mustn't submit work that is not your own. I know that you wouldn't do that. In the past, when students have attempted to try to do that, it's been an absolute failure because it's perfectly obvious when a piece is not your own work. So don't do that. Don't lend work to other students because that causes complications. Don't include bits in your short story or a commentary which is copied directly from somewhere else, like books or the internet. And make sure also that your mum doesn't type up the work for you. Okay, so all those things are forbidden. Now, how do you get the highest possible grade? I will tell you how. First of all, use form creatively and innovatively. So let's say, for example, you're writing a Gothic horror short story. So you're going to be drawing upon some of the genre characteristics that you'd expect to find in a Gothic horror story, but you're going to do it in a creative and innovative way. You're not just going to slavishly go through a kind of list of tick box features. you're going to use the form in a creative and innovative way. It may be that you subvert some of those generic features. You're going to write completely accurately, of course, i.e. your spelling and your punctuation and grammar are going to be completely controlled. You're going to provide engaging content for challenging your audiences and showing ambition. This is very important, that you're going beyond what you might have produced as a school student in Key Stage 3 or 4, that you're not just doing something like you would have done for your AQA exam where you're asked to do a piece of descriptive writing. No, it has to be a challenging piece and it has to show some kind of ambition. You also need to show skillful and detailed manipulation of register at all levels. So you've got to make sure that it's consistently quality all the way through. What we often find with students is that they start off with great intent and the openings to their narratives are very, very carefully crafted. And then by the time you get to the 600th word, it's becoming a bit looser. Okay, so the very best students keep the quality all the way through. And then finally, guide your reader through a very coherent and cohesive text where there is a strong sense of structure. Those are your A grade skills for A level. We do have a process that goes on here. I mean, you are going to be studying a range of star models. You are then going to be selecting one of these star models that you think, that's the one for me. That's the one I'm going to be emulating some of those features in my piece. You're going to make sure that you run past us your star model. The last thing we want you to do is to choose a star model which isn't very good. Students often do this. They run to the internet, they find something that's not very good, which superficially has some nice tricks in it, but actually doesn't stand very close scrutiny. So make sure that you've got the blessing of your teacher. And then you're obviously going to be using your research to inform your own short story. Here are some wise words by writers. Almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. So, yeah, don't let the sort of poor quality of your initial drafts paralyze you. Remember that almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. I'm sure that Shakespeare's first draft of Hamlet was probably not very good. Okay, so the key on writing great narrative is to live with the rather poor initial efforts that you do, but to have the perseverance to write, rewrite, rewrite. Okay. I love this quotation. The worst thing that you write is better than the best thing that you didn't write. Okay, because there are lots of people out there who want to be writers, but actually don't spend the time and take the trouble to actually sit and write. So the worst thing that you write is better than the best thing that you didn't write. Here is the master himself, Stephen King. If you want to be a writer, you must do two things above all others. Read a lot and write a lot. Put the emphasis on that, reading a lot. You know, if you're going to be a great writer, you've also got to be a wide reader too. 4 basic premises of writing: clarity, brevity, simplicity, and humanity. Clarity means being clear. Brevity means being brief and concise. Simplicity and humanity. It's a really good quotation to remember. Start writing no matter what. The water doesn't flow until the faucet is turned on. There's Louis L'Amour. He was a plumber. Faucet is a tap. And when writing, things rarely go according to plan. You might as well let the character take over and enjoy the ride. I like that quotation because, you know, planning a short story is not the same as planning a geography essay about erosion. You know, and in a sense, narrative often has a life of its own, and you must let the characters take over, because the most important element in your story is going to be the characterization. If we care about your characters, then it's going to be an interesting story that you tell. The desire to write grows with writing, says Erasmus. Great words of wisdom. Okay, so when you're constructing your short stories and when you're writing your commentary about your short stories, these sorts of words are going to spring to mind. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. Let's talk about characterization. I mentioned before, characterization is the most important element of what you're doing here. If we don't care very much about the characters, then it doesn't matter what kind of fancy plot that you've produced. It doesn't matter. So your characters need to be flexible. They shouldn't be static, and they shouldn't be stereotypes. And there should be some kind of development that comes through your narrative so that we think and feel about your characters in different ways at the end from what we did at the very beginning. It may well be that you want to put quite a lot of figurative language into your a short story. That's great. Metaphor, the sea is a hungry dog. Simile, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Personification, the clouds were dancing across the sky. So by all means, use figurative language. Don't overdo it, though. Don't over-egg the pudding. The whole point of the short story is not necessarily for you to show off a whole load of devices. The whole point of it is to entertain through intricate and interesting characterization. It may well be that you want to do some kind of foreshadowing so that you put things at the beginning of your narrative which are then going to emerge as important later on. So that's called foreshadowing. That would be an important element. Obviously, you're going to have to play with genre features. If this is a romantic story that you're doing, if it's a science fiction story, then you need to be drawing upon some of those generic features which readers would expect to find in that genre of narrative. Narrative perspective is an interesting one. We'll talk a bit more about that later on as the videos go on. But you have choices, don't you? It could be first, second, or third person narrative. Each of those have advantages and benefits, but they also have constraints and weaknesses as well. So make sure that you choose the narrative perspective that's most right for your particular story. And it's a good idea to use the same narrative perspective as your style model. In terms of the plot and the structure, it could well be that you go for something simple that moves forward sequentially in a chronological way. It may well be that you want to mix things around. You might do, for example, in terminus res, which is a Latin noun phrase meaning at the end of things, which means that you start your story with the very ending. And we know films do that quite a lot. If you think of the classic Titanic film from 1997, that starts in terminus res because you've got the old lady who's the survivor of Titanic who starts off the film. Okay, so you could think about structure. You could think about ways that you could mix things around. What else have we got? Pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is a good figurative technique to use. So this is where you describe the environment, often the weather, so that it reflects something of the character's thoughts or feelings or mood. So, for example, a boy has just been dumped by his girlfriend and he goes out and walks through the rain. So there's a very simple example of pathetic fallacy. Okay, I'm not sure that I want to do any more than that, but if there are any of those that you're unsure about, do some research, for example, about the difference between, say, pathos and bathos. In a word, pathos meaning inspiring pity, so making you feel sad, whereas bathos is comic anticlimax. So if you're doing a comic story, it may well be that you want to include some bathos. Incidentally, talking about humour, don't feel that humour is off limits. If you can produce a piece that has humorous effects in it in quite sophisticated ways, go for it. Okay, let's think about 50-word stories. This is a really good exercise to get you in the mood for writing really concise, trimmed-down narratives. Here's an example. It's called Toothbrush, Toothbrush, Toothbrush by Kenneth Hamner. And then they quit their jobs and burned their McMansion to the ground. Holding hands, their smiles disappeared as she mentioned they had no toothbrushes. He got a job first. They purchased the essentials. Then cars, iPhones, designer clothes. After another stressful workday, they exchange glances and that's how it goes, and then they. Okay, they're a really clever little 50-word short story, this, isn't it? It's genuinely innovative, it's challenging, it's an unusual title, and what I'd say to you on your short stories is do interesting things with your title. A title like that makes you think, what's going on? An unusual structure as well, beginning with a coordinated connective like that, as if you're halfway through the middle of a sentence. And what's it all about? Is it a critique of consumerist society? Maybe. Well, that's up to you to decide. So I've got some other examples here of fantastic 50-word stories. Let's just click through them. So, counting the coins, the man watched in the darkness as the officers arrested his friends and led him away. He had alerted the government. Was he a traitor? Some said the captive was a crackpot, while others loved him. Once again, he counted his reward money and sighed. 30 pieces of silver. All sorts of questions to be asked there. And if you know your story from the Bible about Jesus being betrayed by Judas Iscariot, you'll really get to the heart of this narrative. So intertextuality is going to help you get that particular 50-word story. The long walk. It's me or the dog, she barked. Dinner was apparently ruined. Max was in his bed, half asleep, one ear up. I mean it, she growled, teeth bared and muzzleless. She pattered away. I sighed, got up and went to pack my bags. Max stretched, dog yawned, then rose and followed. Okay, that's a really good example of characterization, isn't it? Where you've got your three characters and we get to infer things simply from things like the verbal verbs there, like she barked and she growled, with those anthropomorphic details there that tell us a lot about the she of this story. Okay, so there are other ones that are in 50-word stories, other 50-word stories in your booklet. Have a look at them. And then what I'd say to you is try out doing some of these. Here are some suggestions of 50-word short story ideas. Cast your eye down here. It may be that you've got an interesting photograph in front of you. Why don't you base a short story around that image? Why don't you start a story with those three words? Why don't you entitle a story after a famous work of literature like Great Expectations or An Inspector Calls? It may be that you want to experiment by doing a short story with second-person narrative, like you. Okay, maybe you want to do a story that focuses on the different senses. Why not try doing a short story that's entirely written in dialogue? Here's a difficult one. Write a short story without any characters. Or maybe write a short story that's just one single sentence. Or how about writing a short story that's set 500 years in the future? Here are some other examples. Write a story that ends as it begins. Like the toothbrush one. Write a story in which all three main characters die in different ways, quite macabre. You could write a story which is an allegory, and if you're not sure what an allegory is, look it up. Write a letter in which each word begins with the next consecutive letter of the alphabet. Oh, I see. A bat crashed down, etc. Write a story, half of which is written in a different language, maybe Bulgarian. I know, why not write a story set in a cafe in Spennymoor? You could do something autobiographical, couldn't you? Okay, these are just practice pieces. What I'd say to you is pick from that list there, 3 or 4 of them, and have a go at submitting those as short stories. Okay, we're going to leave it there. That's been an introduction to the short story writing for your coursework, and I hope you enjoy it.